Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my June wrap-up. I'm debating on how to do these pretty well because I read quite a bit in a month. This month, well, last month, June, is 52 books, so I don't want to take up too much of people's time. I'm just going to try to clip by as much as I can. Some of these are going to be very short because they're just short stories or Audible originals or stuff like that. And others I might give a few minutes to if I think that it's necessary and I have something to say about it. Otherwise, I'm just going to give a rating and a brief impression, and hopefully this video will be quite quick. The first book is Memorial by Brian Washington. I think this has been covered quite a bit on BookTube. I thought it was a good book. I gave it 4 stars. Very evocative, interesting prose, and it is a short book that moved along nicely. The next book is Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin. I really liked this. The perspective wasn't my favorite. It's another second person and present tense, I believe. So it's telling you the story all of the time as if you were the actual person experiencing it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, just like in Broken Earth, but it has a very interesting conceit to it, and I think it was well done. Next is Kim Jae-young, born 1982. Similarly, I think I even learned about this maybe on BookTube, but it's just making the rounds quite a bit this year and maybe last year. I think it's about a year old. Great book, very short. It has a lot to say about Korean culture, feminism, and women in the workforce over there. I thought it was pretty well crafted. I enjoyed it and gave it 4 stars. Then I read Roomy Poems. I selected Roomy Poems specifically because the essential Roomy is not Roomy at all. It is a man named Coleman who basically read interpretations of translations of Rumi, got inspired, and then tried to put down his own thoughts about each poem. So it was a facsimile, and it's watered down from Western culture to Eastern culture erasure. There's a lot of controversy around that book in particular, and Coleman in general, I think. But Rumi Poems has 4 or 5 different translations of poems, so you get to see how each one differs from the translation. There's notes sometimes. It's just a really great collection. I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was incredible. Whatever you're looking for from Rumi, you'll probably find in this collection just because it's selected. It's I think like an everyman selection library pick or something like that, so I thought it was well curated and great. And it exposes Coleman, his perspective, I think, quite a bit. You can see his translation of the poems, which is usually Western philosophical / to do with Jesus and God and Solomon and stuff, when it's the actual spirit of the poem is something completely different. Next, I read All the Ugly and Wonderful Things. I gave this 2 stars because I would have given it even 1 star. I hated it. I talked about this on my last video, the mid-year freakout tag. I talked about this a little bit, but basically it's a love story romance that has weird consent issues between a 28-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they make it out to be that she's like a precocious girl who's going after the young guy, but there's no character development, there's not very good prose, there's not very good plot. I didn't like any aspect of this book. However, I did finish it, and when I do that, I usually try to give a book at least 2 stars instead of 1. Next, I read Beyond Redemption, and I gave that 3 stars. I made a video on it, so I won't go into it. The next book is Tectonics by Malka and Older. This is the 3rd book in a series of cyberpunk books that are really great. I highly recommend it. I rated this one 4 stars. The concept in the book is a lot better than, I would say, the plot, but it's just a really interesting thought experiment with democracy, and it's got really interesting characters, diversity, lots of inclusion, and the concept alone is just completely worth the ticket to ride, basically. Some of the books are more plot heavy than others, but if you're interested in cyberpunk and a new take on institutional government and democracy itself, check out this series. It's incredible. It's so good. You'll love it, I'm sure. Just go in with the caveat that it's not an espionage spy thriller type, which is somehow what the market has got. The marketing makes it seem to be sometimes, and you'll be happy. Next, I read History of Wolves by Emily Fridland. I gave this 4 stars. I think this has been talked about a lot because it was on the Booker Prize, I think, at one point. Something like that. It was on a pretty prestigious long listing, I think. Maybe even short listing. I thought it was great. It's got a very interesting prose style. It has an interesting plot. It's unlike most books. It's about a girl who lives out in a abandoned commune who experiences a coming of age, and it's kind of like an unhinged woman's story, and it just does a lot of interesting things that it doesn't seem to get too much credit for, unfortunately, even though it was long listed or short listed, whatever the case may be. I still feel like it needs a little bit more love, but it seems to be pretty polarizing. I liked it though. 4 stars is a good rating for me. Next, I read The Martian Chronicles, another 4-star read. This comically I conflated with the Barsoom books, and my dad has been on me to read this book forever, and I kept being like, oh yeah, John Carter, that'll be fun. And I'm sure I would enjoy those books as well if in the right mindset. This is not like that book at all. It's pretty heavily science fiction, speculative fiction. I thought it was great. I gave it 4 stars. It's a classic book, so I don't think I need to go into it, but I liked it quite a bit. Another classic book that I read was Catch-22. I gave that 2 stars. I hated it, but I did finish it, so I gave it 2 stars instead of 1 star. What I didn't like about it was basically I drew a comparison where it's kind of like old stand-up comedy where they're trying to make a satirical point and in the process still being extremely misogynistic and shitty on other angles, but think they're quite clever because they're punching up towards institutions. Women exist just to be slept with in the text. It just feels uninteresting and not really needed because other books have made this point and it's kind of in the general intellect anyway. So I don't even think you even need to read this book, but some people really love it. Who knows? Just wasn't for me, I guess. Then I read The Secret History, which I loved and I made a video on. I gave it 5 stars. Check out the video if you want to see more of that. Next, I read The Pillars of the Earth. I gave it 3 stars, which some people might think is low for such a book that's well regarded and well talked about and is a modern classic probably. But my rating system I try to put into expectations framework so that if it's an indie author versus a classic versus whatever the case may be, I'm still kind of giving it its fair shake, and the books that are classics kind of need to do more work to impress me because my expectations are higher for them. So I feel that there's an equilibrium, and then the 5 stars sort of my X factor, loved it a lot type of thing usually. Pillars of the Earth met my expectations exactly. I thought it was pretty good. There's definitely some weird things with white knighting and some misogyny and some other factors that I didn't really care for and seemed very convenient for some of the characters. Especially in the beginning, there's some very weird circumstances where, like, the guy embarks on a journey, loses his wife. The wife's only dying wish is for him to build a cathedral, his own dream, and nothing to do with her whatsoever. Right after that, they abandon the child while she was dying in childbirth. That's how she succumbed to death. He abandons the child, then he comes back, the child's gone. While he's sort of like resting and in a daze, some woman comes to see if he's okay. They have sex, and she knows where the child is, and they sort of like embark on this long quest together, and it felt very contrived and odd. But even from those first few chapters, they get worked into the plot pretty well later. So in the end, it wasn't so bad, but it did feel very strange sometimes, basically. Maybe some subsequent books in the series are better for those kinds of things, but I don't think I'll continue with the series after that kind of a start. It was just fine. Next, I read Her Turn. Again, I did this, I talked about in the mid-year freakout. I quite liked it. I gave it 4 stars. It's coming out at the end of this month, so I'll make a video on that at the time. Until then, it's sort of like not embargoed, but there's no point in really talking about it because it's not even out. I thought it was great though. Next, I read Pizza Girl, which I thought was really great. I gave it 4 stars. It's very dark humor is what I got out of it, and well written, fast pacing, interesting character, has a lot to communicate about grief and about just the verisimilitude of like a high school student life and finding like the humor and joy in uncertain, weird circumstances. And the book is just got an odd quality that I think you don't find elsewhere. Then I read Effect by Charlene Ellsby. I made a video on this. Yeah, it's right there. I made a video on this, so if you want to, you can check that out. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Incredible book. Then I read The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. I gave this 3 stars. I thought it was fine. Had I not read the Broken Earth trilogy already, which I think is sort of like her peak writing at its best, I might have given it more, but it just felt a little bit lackluster and a strange plot, but interesting concepts. Next, I read Topics of Conversation by Miranda Popke. Gave this 5 stars, absolutely loved it. It was kind of a Southpaw Sidewinder for me. I didn't see it coming. It doesn't have too many Goodreads reviews that are very positive, and it's written in a spoken word type of way apparently that doesn't really jibe with people, but I bought the book after listening to the audiobook spoken aloud, and I thought it was incredible. It's very moving, part of the Me Too movement, extremely well written, when spoken aloud at least. It was great, and it's very endearing in its honesty, I thought, but some people just didn't really like the main character. I thought it was completely fine, but maybe it's different when you're consuming it as a physical product. I don't know. Then I read At Night, All Blood is Black by David Diop, and that book I gave 4 stars, and I made a video on that, so I'll link it. Then I gave 4 stars to Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Apologies if not. But I thought that was a great book. I thought it was very moving. It had a lot of interesting stuff to do with food that I think went over my head, but I think I got the thematic point of it at least to some degree. This is being talked about a lot already, but I throw my hat in for recommending it. It was a very good read. So then I read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was slightly uneven due to the structure of the book with how the short fiction functions, which is kind of how short fiction always works with me. It's really hard for it to get a 5-star collection because some things hit me very well and other things completely miss me, and that's just how short story collections tend to go for me. It's very few and far between that they're so even in being excellent when they're talking about disparate things that, you know, it's just the nature of the beast. Next I read North and South, a classic book. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was excellent. The prose is definitely a little bit interesting. I think it won't jibe with some people, but I thought it was great. And the overall themage, if that's a word, the themes worked quite well and the characters were well developed. It had an interesting point. It felt more modern than it was. Recommend it. Then I read House of Glass, the story of secrets of a 20th century Jewish family by Hadley Freeman. I gave this 4 stars. I liked it so much that I actually ordered a copy for my grandma, who's really into stories like this. This is a story that's like so out there that you would expect it to be like a screenplay or something like that, but it's all fact-checked, it's all true. It's so interesting, so compelling. If you're interested in family histories that go back 2 world wars and a little bit of change, I believe, and just the wildest intersections between the family and what happened, you know, with World War II for a family like that in Paris and area, then check it out. Also, you know, content warnings for what you would expect with a Jewish family and the Nazis. So next I read Children of Land by Marcelo Hernandez Castillo. I gave this 3 stars. I don't know why it didn't speak to me as much as I thought it would. The story is something that usually resonates with me. I think it was just something, the voice, that put me off a little bit. I thought structurally, basically, I think it's very interesting, but it's maybe just a little bit too meta for me in its construction, with its describing certain sections as movements, and I don't know anything about poetry, and this man is a poet, so maybe just some stuff went completely over my head, but I still gave it 3 stars and I quite enjoyed it. So next I read Know My Name by Chanel Miller, who was the victim of Brock Turner, and this is her entire story chronicling that. I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was wildly well written, very just a level of presence in the text and like the willingness to examine her life, the institutions, different people, and her perspective is staggering. I think it should be required reading for pretty much everybody. It is something, it's a moment that, well, not 9/11-esque, but something that everybody probably knows about with Brock Turner, at least where I am in Canada. And this person adding her voice to the conversation, especially from what you know about this case in the media, is super enlightening and compelling and interesting. Obviously content warnings for sexual assault and digging into trauma and the peripheral things that has to do with it. Next I read Sabrina and Corina by Callie Fajardo Anstein. Hopefully I pronounced that right. Apologies if not. This was a short story collection where, again, it was uneven for me. I think it would have been a 4-star read if a couple of the stories felt more thematically engaged and interesting, because the problem is there's 3 of them in there that are just excellent short stories. They absolutely kill it. And then some of them are just sort of, by comparison, just being stacked up against those ones, kind of fell short a little for me. But it's very interesting. it has an interesting theme, interesting characters, and again, content warning for sexual assault, I believe, in this one, and violence against women in all forms, basically. Next, I read The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell. I gave it 3 stars. The way I think of Malcolm Gladwell is he's an entertaining writer who he claims that he just wants to start a conversation about things. I think that's fine. He should be putting that in his text directly, though, and telling people that this is not a well-researched academic paper. This is just him trying to start a conversation around these topics, and then most of the controversy would go away, at least for this particular book and others. I know that with Talking to Strangers, he crosses the territory into just being completely problematic, so I'm not going to be reading that book. So I read these ones, though, because I was gifted them as physical copies, so I read them, and I'll probably donate them or something like that. Next, I read The Haunting of Tramcar 015 and The Angel of Khan el Khalili in the Jin Universe. Those are 2 connected. One's a short story and one is a novella, both by P. Djeli Clark. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right as well. And he did Ring Shout as well. That was pretty big. If you probably had heard of that. Ring Shout also was quite good, I thought. These are much more my speed with him, though. I really like the world that he created. It's like an alternate timeline where it's like steampunk in Eastern cultures that are like a melange, and lots of different interesting spiritual stuff that's going on. Even the detectives that are in each of these kind of stories figuring out what's going on, and like the haunting or other stuff like the angel going on. It's all rooted in different cultures and done in a respectful way, and the contrast from Western cultures stories of that is just so different and stark that you can't help but be pulled into this world, because it's just so different and interesting and unique and creative. And there's just so much. It's worth it just to be in that world and discovering the things that he is writing about. And this year he has a new book out called The Master of Jin, and I'll definitely be checking that out after these. Next, I read Heretics of Dune. I thought it was fine. I gave it 3 stars. Most of the Dune books I've just been giving 3 stars. I think I might have given 4 to the first one, which I thought was particularly well done, even though it has problematic elements for sure. But Heretics feels like it went off the rails a little bit after God Emperor. Things are getting much stranger, and I'm just basically reading to find out how it ends now. But it's different than what I expected, and still interesting, but the plot is a lot more basic than I expected, and I'm getting less of the things that I like about that world, which is the spirituality, its interrogation of the savior complex and white saviors, and religion and things like that. It's sort of like, yeah, just going off the rails, like I said. I still enjoyed it for what it was, but by no means is the series a favorite of mine in science fiction or anything like that. Next, I read Latsaway by Darcy Little Badger. I gave this 3 stars just because it didn't really jibe with what I expected it to be. It's an urban fantasy with lots of supernatural weird stuff going on. The world building felt pretty soft. I didn't feel like I was grounded in the world very well. Things just sort of happened, and I was interested, but I was never invested in any aspect of it, so I ended up just thinking it was a middling read. But I was surprised because most people gave it 4 stars for my friend group on Goodreads, so maybe check out other reviews and see what other people are saying. Maybe they're more steeped in the genre and get it better than I did. How to Do Nothing, which I had to DNF because about 30% in it started getting all gobbled and goopy, and like the file from the library was all messed up or something like that. I tried it on 2 different devices and it did that, so I guess it's just rural Canada, the file is messed up or something, I don't know. I was enjoying it while it lasted though, but I didn't give it a review score, of course, and have a note here to return to it in a physical format. Then I read Severance by Ling Ma. I have a video on that, so just go check that out. Then I read Shadow of the Night by Deborah Harkness. I gave this 4 stars. Objectively, it probably is like a 3-star read, but I just read those books, and particularly that series, when I'm in that mood for exactly what it's doing. And then I was kind of just surprised because them going back in time in this second installment of the book was a lot more steeped in like Elizabethan lore, which I have no idea about, so maybe it's accurate, maybe it's not, I'm not sure, but it was really interesting. The plot was cool. You get to meet some historical figures. More witch stuff happens. That was really cool. Overall, I liked it a lot. The prose are pretty straightforward. Some people call it a beefy book, but for me it's not. I've been reading a lot of like 700, 800, 900 page books and stuff like that. So 550 pages of fun was completely fine for me. It is what it is. Next, I read Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. This would have been 4 stars, but I remember the similes especially, and some of the writing just felt a little bit amateurish for me. The similes especially, where he does the thing where he draws attention to a simile to make it feel grounded in like a texture or something tangible, but then right after it we'll make another simile that completely contradicts that and kind of uproots the entire paragraph for me, where I'm trying to figure out what exactly he's talking about. I'm pulled out of the fiction, and it's just it might just be a me problem, to be honest, but it feels, if it is well written in a style that I'm not aware of, then it doesn't it doesn't work for the way my brain works, for whatever that's worth. Otherwise though, the plot was very interesting. It's almost Southern Gothic feeling in its stark depictions of poverty and institutionalism and different cultural dynamics and stuff like that. So I liked that aspect of it. Had it not been for the writing, it would have been a 4-star read for me for sure. Then I read The Highway, which is the second book in the Highway Quartet by C.J. Box. I read this because I watched the Big Sky TV show and liked it a lot. But the TV show is much better than the source material. It's updated, it's more diverse. There's a trans character that sort of centers the victim's narrative that this doesn't have in the book. And the book is just sort of like a middling commercial fiction pick for me, basically. The characters were okay. It more or less follows the events of the show, but the show just sort of kicks it up a notch, and it's the superior story for me, which is the odd thing. Usually books are better, but not this time. Then I read Veda Nostra, and I made a video on that. 5 stars, loved it. I read it twice in a row, so that's another one. Then I read Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka. Then I read Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. Hopefully that's pronounced right. And I thought this was great. I saw people kind of dunking on it on Goodreads, but I thought it was really interesting. It's sort of like she's not, the main character works at a convenience store. She's an older woman, like 33, 34 or something. You expect it to be like she's a teenager and she has this job, but instead it's like You know, she's old and she's working there, she's not a manager, she's not progressing, but she's very happy with her life. She finally found a place that accepts her. She kind of understands the rules of the job, she excels at it, she's quite happy, but everybody around her acts as external pressure and conflict for her, which was really interesting. Everyone was trying to put societal expectations on her, and the way that she's not neurotypical is kind of like in a Dexter-ish way, where she doesn't really understand feelings and she just does what she wants, and she's sort of LARPing a normal human, basically. But it's done in a really humanizing way. I thought she was very interesting. I liked her insights about people and life, and just liked being in her headspace a lot. It was a great book. I gave it 4 stars. Then I read Runaway Jury, which, by the way, is another one that I thought the movie was better. This is John Grisham. It felt like commercial fiction. It was fine, but the movie moved it from tobacco to firearms, which feels more prescient. And the movie does more character development, so you kind of understand what's going on with things more early than the book. And the book was just a little bit dry, which I think is maybe just Grisham's style and just not for me. So I gave it 2 stars. I didn't like it very much. Then I read Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khan. This comes out this month at some point, so I will make a video on it. I don't think it's out yet, so I don't want to make the mistake of talking about it before it's even out. This Mortal Coil I read next, 4 stars, Emily Suvada. This came out like 3 years ago and I kept putting it off, but it's actually pretty fun. It's a zombie trope that has been modified. The author understands virology, I believe that's the word. The dynamics of the actual science for what the virus does is something that is possible if engineered, basically, which I thought was interesting. It does really weird stuff, but apparently is possible. And it's got like a romance thing going on. It's young adult. I liked the characters, I liked the plot, and there's another 2 books in the series, and I'll definitely be looking into it. I thought it was decent. I gave it 4 stars. Next I read Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez. This was an Audible book, and I thought the narrator was quite good. It's a short story collection that's really strong. It spoke to me a lot. I haven't been to Toronto too often, but it's very clever in its depiction of all of the problems and all the joys and the goodness and the badness of Toronto at a cultural identity level, racism, institutional problems, and in a humanizing way for each of the characters. I thought it was great. I thought it lived up to the hype. Then I read Foundation and Empire, the second book in Foundation, which I think will be the last for me. I gave it 2 stars, or I gave it 3 stars, so it must have just eked in there. It was fine. The thing I'm finding with Asimov books is I really like the concepts, I don't like the characterization, and I hate the dialogue. It sounds like B-movie dialogue or something like that. The overall structure of the prose is whatever. It's neither good nor bad. It's just sort of bland. It's easy to not pay attention to in a commercial fiction-y kind of way, basically. But people really liked Foundation, and it's another book that people recommended to me, and then it sort of falls short. I think people just have rose-colored glasses when they recommend things, especially science fiction. That's old. Next I read Walking with Ghosts by Gabriel Byrne, one of my favorite actors. There was probably no chance that I was not going to like this book. I gave it 5 stars. He narrates it himself. It's his life story. It's a memoir. It's excellently written. I thought the prose, the diction, the syntax, the musicality of the voice, it sounds like him. It drills down into really insightful and impactful moments of his history that sometimes you get with famous people memoirs and sometimes you don't. It's like hit and miss, sometimes pretty fake feelings, sometimes really endearing and special when it sings, and this is one of those things. This is the way that I expected to feel about Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey, because people kept saying it was cerebral and interesting, and I didn't think it was that at all. This is actually cerebral, interesting, very dynamic. It moves between his life in interesting thematic ways. He talks about acting, he talks about important things in his life. Yeah, I thought it was just incredible. Then I read Murder on the Orient Express, Agatha Christie. It's a staple. I gave it 4 stars. Not much to say on it. It's fun. I liked it. And that's about it. The next book is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum. I give it 3 stars. It was just kind of exactly what I expected, and it was fine, but you know, you're an adult, you're reading a children's book. It didn't really capture the magic that I thought it would, even though I was in the mood for it, but it was decent, it was fine. The next 3 are part of the Nameless books by Dean Koontz. And this is actually 6 in the series. I only made it through 3. I rated each of them 2 stars, and I just didn't care about them. I found it formulaic, boring prose, boring character work, a tried and true concept that didn't get executed very well, and the thriller aspect of it is completely deflated because Nameless is a person who sees things coming, and we just find out if he intervenes in time or not, or fixes the problem or not. So there's not really the thriller aspect of the people that are actually in danger never actually happens, because we know that whatever they do doesn't matter whatsoever. It matters what Nameless does if he gets there in time and those situations. So the book doesn't even really feel like it starts until he gets there, and it's a short story, so then it's over like 3 pages later or whatever. So it didn't work for me at all, is what it is. Next I read The Living Mountain, a celebration of the Cairngorm Mountains of Scotland by Nan Shepherd. I gave it 4 stars. The poetry in this is so good, it's excellent. Tilda Swinton narrates it, so it's obviously great. Pacing-wise and plot-wise, it's very meandering and almost feels pointless sometimes, but the pointlessness is the point, so you'll either kind of love it or not. It didn't have the X factor to bring it up to a 5 stars for me, but the poetry and musicality and just the subject matter is very interesting. Supposedly she invented the mountain fiction genre, or helped pioneer it. I've never heard of it, but I'll tell you one thing: if we could get travel logs or travel in fantasy that is as evocative and interesting and aware of the ecosystem and whatnot as this, it would be a killer book, I think. People already don't mind Tolkien talking about trees all of the time, might as well make it as interesting as this book. Next I read The Case of the Missing Marquee, Enola Holmes' book. I rated it 3 stars. It was exactly what I expected. It was a fine YA book with the same premise as the TV show that I already saw, so it just met my expectations and it was pretty fun. It was free on Audible for last month, and so it was a good time. Then I read Daughter from the Dark. I already have a review up of that. I gave it 4 stars. It's by the same people who did Veda Nostra. It's good. Check out the video if you want to know more. The last book of the month that I read was To the Lighthouse, which I loved, Virginia Woolf. I listened to it narrated on an audiobook. I love the themes. I love the stream of consciousness. I love the plot. I thought it was so well done, so well structured, still experimental, felt very modern, and I just loved it. I'll definitely be checking out more Virginia Woolf stuff. It was fantastic. And that's it. So if you stuck with me that long, thank you. Hopefully it's rapid enough that this video is short. Let me know your thoughts on what I read, what you read in that month, and feel free to recommend me any books based on the stuff that I'm reading now. My name is Fraser, and I'll see you later.